Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby, and I'm here with the wonderful Rick Ellis, Tony nominee for Water for Elephants. Uh, Rick, obviously this story started as a novel, and I'm curious when you get this, task to make an adaptation, what's kind of the one thing about this book that makes you latch on and say, okay, this is my way in to this story?
Well, it's a really interesting question because I had read the novel when it came out, which was I think maybe 19 years ago or 18 years ago, something like that. 2006, yeah, so 18 years ago, and I was in a book club, and I was that guy in a book club full of women, and and I would hang out with these women. We would talk about books, and Water for Elephants came in, and everyone was very excited. And I was in a previous life, I was creative director at an advertising agency, and for almost 20 years, I did the advertising for Big Apple Circus, and for 8 or 9 years, did the advertising for Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, and so I had some circus connection to it, and read it as a circus novel, and enjoyed it as a circus novel. And and then 10 years went by, and the producers, Peter Schneider and Jen Costello, our producers, called me to ask me if I would be interested in adapting this novel. I had just done a show called Peter and the Starcatcher, which was adapted from a novel. So in that way that people tend to ask you to do the thing that you've just done in show business, I thought, uh, well, doing a play, Peter and Starcatcher was a play. So Water for Elephants as a musical, okay, so it'll be different. And then I had seen these seven guys, this theater collective of seven guys called Pigpen Theater Company, perform downtown in Washington Square a play of their own devising called The Old Man and the Old Moon, that they created and performed. And they were like just like my children in the theater. The uh, story theater, a very imaginative, very much, very sort of do-it-yourself DIY feeling, which is the kind of theater that I love. Which was exactly what happened with Peter and the Starcatcher, for example, with Jersey Boys, for example. Very, very low tech. Everybody moves their own stuff, sort of like real community of actors doing everything, not decorative scenery, but objects that are used and reused in different ways, so that the audience gets to lean in and participate in imagining. And that's the sort of theater that I love. So I thought it would be interesting, maybe, to write a show in the way that film or television is written, namely a writer's room, as opposed to just me and one other person, composer, lyricist, or two other people. I thought it would be interesting for eight of us to be in the to try to hatch a show. And I thought it would be interesting for them to write a score that wasn't going to be performed by them. So they could write for female voices, they could write for duos and trios, they could write for an ensemble, they could have a horn section, they could do this sort of jazz or jazz fusion stuff that I felt, might be in the realm of our sound, and also because they're, at the time, 9 years ago, they were basically fresh out of school, and they were, and I wanted to serve up this great new sound for Broadway. Everybody's always talking about, where are the new people, where are the new generations, and paying it forward is something that I really believe in and I think is important. So all of that had come into play, and then uh, my life took a tragic turn, and my husband of 35 years suddenly was struck down with brain cancer and died. And I was sitting in my room, with a broken heart, not really knowing what to do, suddenly being an individual for the first time in my life, not really knowing how to be one person, because I'd always been part of a couple, and not really knowing what the point was of going on, all those things that you think about when your heart is broken and you survive. It's one thing to be the person who gets the horrible disease and then dies, but it's terrible in a different way for the person who has to watch that happen and then be alone. And there's Water for Elephants sitting on my table. And of course, now I don't think of it as a circus story anymore. Now I think about it as the story of somebody coming to terms with what it's like when you lose everything. And it made it very, very personal for me. So, so yes, there's the bulk of the story as Sarah Gruen, constructed it, created it in her wonderful novel, is a young man suddenly orphaned who jumps on a train bound for he knows not where, and over the course of the story he becomes an adult, and because the train he jumps on, he's almost going to jump in front of it. He's so discombobulated because his parents have just died in a terrible accident, and the bank has repossessed the house, and it's the depression, and he doesn't have any money, he doesn't have any wherewithal, and so he thinks he's just going to jump in front of a train, and at the last minute he jumps on it instead, and it just happens to be a circus train. And because it's a circus train, of which there were many in the first part of the 20th century, crisscrossing various regions of the country, bringing the circus to towns and cities. Because it happens to be a circus train he jumps on, it changes the trajectory of his life. It gives him, in fact, a life. The unexpected part of the coming of age story is that the story is told by that guy 50 years later, an older version of this kid. And now he's near the end of his life, and he's haunted by memories that are so vivid that they spring to life before our eyes. And these shadows of the past, I guess, give him the moxie that he's lost, because he has also just suffered loss. His spouse has died after 50 years of marriage. He doesn't know what's happening, what he's going to do. His kids have parked him somewhere in some assisted living facility, and nobody listens to him. Nobody cares about him. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody cares whether he lives or dies. And so he thinks it's over. And because he, in effect, runs away shows up at a circus performance and starts to tell the guy who runs the circus that he once worked on a circus, and the guy is interested in his story, and suddenly he thinks, oh, well, somebody's listening to me for the first time in however long, and he rediscovers his life, essentially. So it's a coming of age story, not in the traditional way, a young person becomes an adult. It's a coming of age story for this older character who thought, it's all over for me. And then by the end of the story, he's got the moxie, I like to say, to sort of change course, proving that it's never too late to start over. And he says, and it's me speaking to the audience, he says, I hate that she's gone, but I'm glad she went first, because being the survivor is terrible. It stinks. And I'm always looking to, when I'm in an audience, I'm always looking for those moments of connection. And it occurred to me in my shell of widowhood, which I hate, that in fact, there's lots of people who understand what that's like. And I felt so isolated and alone. I thought, boy, if somebody had said to me, you're not alone, it would really mean something. It would be like the hand of Sarah Gruen reaching out from the pages of the novel and taking me by the hand, saying, it's going to be okay. You have something that can still be ahead of you. And for the character in our show to be able to say that to people in the audience who might be in that position that I was in, who might end up in that position that I was in, to understand that it's not just happening to them, and that they're not cut off from the world, and they're not completely isolated and distraught, was very meaningful for me. So that's like what gave me the juice to, it's what made the story very, very personal.
Well, beautifully put. I know I too have lost a partner to cancer, and I think what happens a lot of the time when you are that survivor person is you go through a big perspective
Mm.
shift, many perspective shifts, I would say. Do you feel like your creative process has had a big shift after that?
Gosh, these are really good questions. I have to think about that. My creative process, oh God, I, what's that?
That
I,
ephemeral
I,
thing.
I never meant to be a writer. See, I mean,
Mm.
I've just had a lot of different jobs in the theater, over the years. Because I'm this old guy now. I started as a teenager as an actor, and I stage managed, and I danced and choreographed and directed and performed, and then I suddenly was working at an advertising agency that um, all my clients were um, shows, plays, musicals. So I worked on 320 musicals over the years that I was at this shop, and got to sit at tables and listen to Jerome Robbins and Bob Fosse and Tommy Tune and Joe Papp and Mike Nichols and got to listen to writers like Tom Stoppard and Tony Kushner and Lynn Nottage and Terrence McNally and Lynn Miranda and then suddenly I wasn't doing that anymore, and somebody called me and said, "Do you want to write a story about you want to do a Mamma Mia with music of the Four Seasons?" I mean, and I was such an idiot. I thought they were talking about Vivaldi, and and uh, and then he's no, this thing sort of fell in my lap, something I'd never done before. I dragged a friend into it because he was a great writer but also who had never written a musical. And because that turned out to be successful, I started getting asked to do more of it. So my creative process has always been kind of to just be a pinball in my life. When somebody hits the flipper and I go bouncing around, and where I end up is what I do for a while. In terms of where ending up here as a writer, what I try to do is I don't think anything matters but the story. And I think a compelling story is the thing that draws people to the theater. And a compelling story has to have characters that you care about. That's what makes it compelling. And so I suppose my process is to titivate that story. I don't mean plot necessarily, or just plot. I mean also theme, what you want people to talk about after they see it. What's it about, really, as opposed to what happens, which is plot. What are you trying to say? I concentrate a lot on those things, and I also concentrate on the great writer Peter Stone said, writing for the theater is really talking something into existence because it's a collaborative form. So I try to talk a lot to people. The actual writing, is the last thing that I do in the course of my process, which sounds like such a fancy term for what I do, which is really just take really long walks with people and ask questions, and then argue about the answers until there's nothing left to do but sit down at the keyboard and do the dialogue. By then, the characters, if you've done a good job, I think by then the characters are advocating for themselves, and so the dialogue is like the gravy, or the cherry on top of the sundae. That's the funnest part for me, because it's the it's the it's the part is it's your reward for all the thinking and the thought and the arguing and the talking, and the scheming and dreaming that goes into figuring out how, in the course of 2 hours, you're going to be able to tell a particular story. I mean, when you're adapting a novel, for example, the creative process is quite different than if you're inventing your own story, because a 500-page novel like Water for Elephants, that you could read over the course of a month if you wanted to, or you could read the first chapter and, you know, go halfway through the novel and then go back and read the first chapter again, or you could skip to the end and read the last chapter. You could try to do it all in one sitting, or you could only read it at night, or whatever your thing is about reading. But in the theater, you know, it's got to start at 8 o'clock. It's got to be over by 10:15 or so, 10:30 with an intermission. And, you know, that means, and if you're going to have music in it, there's going to be an hour and a half worth of music. That means you got 45 minutes to really tell your story or the story of the novel. How do you figure that out? How do you figure out what to include or what to leave out? How do you figure out which characters to conflate or which characters to eliminate? Are you making the right choices about what you're eliminating, what you're not? So your organizing principle, whatever that is, especially if you're adapting someone else's novel, is the most important thing to come up with, much more important than voicing the characters. Voicing the characters so that they all sound like different people seems to me like the least that a writer can do for the theater. Of course, you want your characters to sound different, but what's the big idea? What's the organizing principle that helps you figure out what to include and what to exclude so that you're still telling a coherent story? And, you know, in the theater, of course, you can tell stories from a particularly theatrical point of view, especially in a memory story like Water for Elephants, because you know, you have license because it's a memory to be more abstract and more impressionistic about what this old guy remembers. Does he remember? He starts talking about the elephant, for example, and he starts talking about, oh, you know, the eyes, the particular eyes. So do we only see the eyes the way you would, you know, right now I'm looking at you and I see you from here up. I don't know if you know, if you're wearing shorts or if you're wearing trousers or if you're wearing, you know, anything at all, or you're wearing sneakers, you're wearing shoes. If I was telling somebody about this 50 years from now, I would only remember a part of you, which is the part that I see. How does that's really useful in the theater, because now I get to imagine what the rest of you was like. And in terms of our title character, Rosie the elephant, we only see her in her totality at a point when in his memory, he remembers the moment where he cracked the code and was able to actually communicate with this animal successfully, up until the point where in the story, the elephant is recalcitrant and seems to be stupid and not paying attention, and they can't connect with the elephant. And there's a reason why they can't, that they only discover accidentally at the end of the first act, cunningly placed, I think, at the end of the first act by the writers, and only at that point you see the full incarnation of the elephant as we present it. As one example, I think, of how it being a memory story became our organizing principle, and that is what dictated the creative process for this particular show. I don't. I guess that's a very long-winded answer to your very good question about what my creative process is. I guess therefore what I'm saying is it's different for every project that I work on. And that may be because I want it to be different so that each project is interesting to me. I'm not, you know, I've only been doing this for 18 years. So I'm actually, like, as a writer, I'm really very young, and I want to do different things. I don't want to do the same thing over and over and over again. I want to try to do it differently, even if it is the same task. And with this particular show, the creative process was really leaning into the idea of it being a memory as opposed to a story that's taking place in real time.
Yeah. Well, real quickly before I have to let you go, this is your fourth Tony nomination. Do you have a favorite memory from your past experiences as a Tony nominee at those ceremonies?
Well, I mean, I remember I was born here in New York and grew up here. And as a kid, I remember my parents took my brother and me to the theater from the time that we were very, very young. He's 3 years older than me. So I was really, really young. And And you could go to the theater in those days. You could sit in the balcony of a show for, 90 cents or a buck and a quarter or something like that. When I was a young teenager and Hal Prince was producing the shows that he was directing, those important Sondheim musicals, Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, 3 years in a row like that, when I was, 14, 15, 16 years old. Hal Prince, as the producer, had an obstructed view policy at his shows for $2. You could see the show for $2. That was still cheaper than a
Wow.
movie. So on a rainy Saturday afternoon, you couldn't go out and play. Um, you could go to see Follies for $2. So, the Tonys for me sort of began then, when these shows that changed my life, that opened my eyes. I thought, oh my God, I've got to do this. I just want to be in rooms like this, watching shows like this for the rest of my life. Um, I guess those Tony Awards, those early Tony Awards were the ones that are the ones that I remember much more vividly than the actual ceremonies that I've attended. That said, of course, when Julie Andrews opened the envelope and said the winner of the Tony Award for Best Musical is Jersey Boys, I was very, very happy because we certainly didn't expect it, and it was great, and it was great because it was Julie Andrews, and Julie Andrews was the star of the first show that I saw when I was a terribly little child, called My Fair Lady, and so I I saw that as being a higher power moment.
Well, maybe we'll have another higher power moment this season. Who knows? But thank you,
Oh,
Rick, so much for joining me. It's wonderful work in Water for Elephants, and everyone who's watching, stick with Gold Derby the rest of this season. Thank you so much.
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.